Welcome back to the Siegfried Wagener Show. Today we're reading Monday, February 16th, 1942. Analysis of Propaganda by Siegfried Wagener. Good evening. Well, Singapore has been taken by the Japs, and German battleships in Brest got clean away. So the Japs are shouting "Banzai" on the shortwaves, and the Nazis are celebrating their own in Dunkirk. When the British thought they had cause, and they had, to be proud of the brilliant feat of getting over 300,000 of their men across the channel right from under the nose of Hitler's still fresh panzer divisions, Nazi propaganda laughed itself hoarse with derision. In all their pride about how it was done, the British felt very humble about Dunkirk, but you never catch a Nazi being humble about anything. On the shortwaves, Berlin tells anybody who cares to listen, what a gorgeous stunt the escape of the 2 battle wagons and 1 heavy cruiser from Brest has been. You can hear that day and night on any transmission, and in all the shades of true Teutonic arrogance, but never a word is said about those Nazi Navy units escaped. That is, that they simply scrammed while the scramming was good. Those ships had been bottled up in Brest for over a year. They could not move one way or another. They were cut off from all effective war action by the most effective British blockade. Nobody thinks for a minute that Hitler invested millions and millions of dollars in these ships simply to let them rot and gather barnacles in the harbor of Brest. His diminished navy needed them badly, but the British Navy was the master of the sea and never let his warship move an inch until he made it the supreme effort, a costly one, to sneak them out. I think Mr. Churchill missed a good chance in his talk yesterday when he failed to point out this, the other side of the story, and never once mentioned the Dunkirk of the Nazi Navy. In spite of all the brilliance of the maneuver, the Nazi ships were routed and utterly driven to flight for their very lives and existence. For one reason or another, it was no longer safe for them to stay in Brest. Maybe the Americans in Northern Ireland are too close for comfort. Maybe there are weak spots in Hitler's long drawn-out waterfront where the ships had to go, regardless whether they were sunk in escape. Hence, when the Nazi radio blasted away with the victory fanfares, I thought that just as funny as if the British had staged a victory celebration after the retreat from Dunkirk. But the silliest talk came, as usual, from Rome radio, which said, I quote, "The British home fleet was sent in 1935 to the Mediterranean to scare Italy. Now it showed that it was not even capable to catch 2 German battleships," unquote. No, it didn't catch them, but it did catch most of the floating coffins which Dust built to protect his second childhood affairs with a 16-year-old girl. At that same senile man about Italy who sold his country and his people to Hitler for a swan song, had one of his brassy hirelings ask American listeners, I quote, "You cannot win the war except by putting every penny you earn into it. Well, do you want this to happen? Do you want to see your whole continent impoverished?" Unquote. Popping that as us sounds like one of those very ancient fairy tales in which idiocy is at a premium. But it is in line with what the Axis people at home are told. Listening to this one, I quote, "We know that the people are not behind Roosevelt, and that is sufficient for us," unquote. This was not a joke, but it was said in dead earnest by one of my Nazi favorites who, if Uncle Sam gives me a chance after I registered for the draft today, I would simply love to meet someday in person. The blooming liar is the Nazi radio editor-in-chief, Hans Fritzsch, who tells the German people on the all highest authority what is what, or what the Nazis think is what. To talk such screaming nonsense might indicate that the Nazi intelligence service in this country consists of a bunch of horrifying numbskulls, and that the geopolitical mastermind of the General Haushaber and his 1,000 scientists better be marked down for mercy killings. But that is not so. The correct information about the American people is undoubtedly available inside Germany, but the Nazi mind simply doesn't want to believe it. The Nazi mind is like the overland pass near MBS KFL listening post in the high country of Colorado. Once you're on it, you have to keep going. There is no chance to turn around, and if another car comes from the other end, you might get stuck for good. In the same way, the Nazi mind is stuck for good. It is one track, one horse affair, and like the overland pass, it leads you giddily into the deep. In that respect, it is typically representative of the class of Germans who hide their pseudo-education and ignorance under the arrogant pretense of knowing everything and knowing it better than everybody else. These people would be laughable were it not that they are the type which is very dangerous. Unfortunately, the German people laughed about them too long. You can find them everywhere in Germany, and mostly among so-called educated people. My earliest recollections of them to date back to a goodly number of my school teachers with whom I had the misfortune to come into contact. Later I found that type among army officers, journalists, writers, and especially so-called scientists. All of these people override a valid argument or an undeniable fact with, "We know better than that." Their knowledge consists of an ill assortment of all kinds of odds and ends, as you will find in any well-stocked junkyard in your neighborhood. Because they read in their youth An American Adventure by Karl May, as author who never set a foot beyond his native Saxonia, they talk as grown-up people with an assumed authority about America that would drive any real American crazy. Because they read a book about sin against the blood by an author who never came within hailing distance of real scientific facts or figures, they defend their notion that they, being a super race and all of the races and people being subhuman, with such hair-raising presumptions as to drive any real biologist or anthropologist out of his skin and into a straitjacket. I remember shortly after I came to America in 1926 reading a book about America by a well-known German journalist. As green as I was at the time, I rolled on the floor with laughter when I read that Americans admired Germany so much that they taught their children in school. What do you think? The Kaiser hymn. The author described it in this way. He had passed by a school and heard the children sing it. He heard the tune all right, but the words, which he didn't understand because he didn't speak English, were, "My country, 'tis of thee, sweet land of liberty." Ha! That author, like the Nazi radio's editor-in-chief, knew it all. He didn't bother to inquire. He needed no proof. For him, the facts were lowly worms in the ground. He felt gloriously supreme about them. He, like his compatriots of the same incredulous mentality, was used to that brushing the realities of life aside and say, "We Germans know that better. And what is more, we know better than anybody else what to do about it." And there you have Hitler and his whole Nazi doctrine in a nutshell. It gives an expression to the worst, jungiest traits of the German mind, which is so encrusted in his Caesarean madness that it could never separate truth from fiction. I don't think that men like this fellow Fritz or Hitler or Goebbels or any Nazi even know when they are lying. They are simply too far gone. In a talk to England, a Nazi broadblaster explained that it was impossible for American factories to run 3 8-hour shifts because they weren't enough workmen, and because the machines wouldn't stand that much strain. Which typical conceit he closed, I quote, "That much for Mr. Knox, England stands alone, and Churchill has said often enough that alone she cannot survive," unquote. For this type of smug, one-sided, sheer, nonsensical Nazi reasoning, only the sky is the limit. This is what another Nazi said to the German shortwave listeners in South America. I quote, "If anything proves the value of National Socialism, it is the uncomparable hitting power of the German army. Compare this to the sloppy British working people who couldn't do the job themselves but had to get help from America. Yes, they did put in some overtime, but quit it when they began to suspect that their bosses profiteered by it. The English workman has no faith in the system as the German who has most characteristic expression in what is a member of the Arbeitsmaschine front. Labor Front said, "German workmen, we must surpass ourselves," unquote. So the German workman says they have to surpass themselves and say the British are sloppy and can't work hard enough and are worried about their bosses profiteering. History repeats itself, doesn't it? Overtime was reduced in England because it was discovered that beyond a certain number of hours per day, the efficiency of working men and women declined rapidly. But it is useless to argue with people who have the notion that they are the master race and they must surpass themselves. Personally, I gave up arguing with Teutonic Jingos who sometimes go by the name Nazis and sometimes by the name of Junkers long before I left Germany, because they are at heart really savages, and they are any number of German authorities whom I could quote on this score. They can be convinced only by one argument: the mailed fist. Only when they are forced to their knees at the point of a bayonet will they see the other fellow's point of view. But even then, they will fall back upon their trick of savage treachery, which makes them such close kin to the Japs, and wherefore I agree with the British radio's advice to the German people, namely, to wipe that type of Teutonic Jingos from the face of the earth. And that is my analysis of propaganda for the present. The shortwave stations I have referred to are London GSC-GRX, Berlin DXJ, DXB, DJB, Rome 2R9 or 2R06, and Tokyo JLG4. Good night.